Tango 911 with that please.
I think somebody got shot. Tell me what to do. He's dying.
I am screaming. Who is this person? Who had that type of evil in them?
We have to capture all of these surveillance cameras. It was an absolute chilling moment. Wasn't expecting that at all.
Holy cow, can't believe this is on video.
This guy is an absolute monster, and we're gonna get him.
"32-year-old luxury bag designer Stephen Gambles is working on his new collection.
Stephen was a very hardworking young man. He was so adventurous, and he was a born artist, literally. He would spend countless hours perfecting a bag, perfecting a stitch. If you're looking at a bag that Stephen made, it's as detailed as anything Louis Vuitton's gonna sell.
As a dad, to see my son creating and designing things, he was great at it. And so I applauded him. He was designing and making to start his own brand.
Hey, Mom.
How's my beautiful baby boy today?
Stephen called me that morning.
I've got some really good news.
He was like, man, Mom, I got this huge deal that I'm putting together. And you just wait. It's gonna be awesome.
Really? Tell me.
And he was so excited and literally glowing as he was talking to me. So I was just, as a mom, so proud.
Has Marcus arrived yet?
Marcus and Stephen, you know, they're brothers, they're best friends. They're each other's world. And Marcus came into town actually to renew his driver's license.
Mom, I gotta get going. I'm meeting a friend tonight.
He was gonna meet a friend at Benihana's, which is his favorite restaurant in the world. It was just his way, you know, the finer things of life.
Okay, take care. Love you lots.
Bye.
I said, I love you. He said, I love you too. I said, okay, I'll see you later. And he said, bye. And I said, no, Bo, we don't say bye. I'll see you later. He said, no, bye, Mom. I will never forget that.
Tango 911 with that please.
Hi. I think somebody got shot in front of the Benihana in Plano.
What's the address?
We're 5800 Legacy Circle. I live there, but it's the mini mart where the Benihana is in Plano. I don't know if someone shot him.
Did you actually see it?
No, the car has crashed into the tree, and I think someone rolled by, shot him, and he drove off. Tell me what to do.
Okay, I need you to find him and tell me if he's awake or if he's breathing.
No, he's dying. He's dying.
Plano police officers arrive within just a few minutes, and they find a white Mercedes sedan crashed into a tree. When they arrived, the vehicle was still running. They found a male in the driver's seat slumped over. The airbags had deployed, but there was blood everywhere. They believed that he had suffered a gunshot wound to his temple, but somehow, miraculously, was still showing signs of life at that time. The male was identified as Stephen Christopher Gambles, Jr.
As EMS rushed Stephen to the hospital, Detective Aaron Benzik arrives on scene.
Having a shooting at the Shops of Legacy is unusual. It's a very safe place. It's filled with businesses, restaurants, corporations, places to live, and is kind of the heart of our city. Upon my arrival to the crime scene, the first thing I'm seeing is that our patrol officers have a large scene taped off, and I see a white Mercedes that has crashed into a tree. Inside, I can see a large amount of blood. I can see an orange hat laying on the center console. And I see that there's damage to the front windshield, and that something significant has happened inside of this vehicle.
Look at this.
Underneath the driver's seat, we do locate a cartridge casing from a spent round that came from a 9mm gun.
No firearm?
None.
We do not find any gun inside of the Mercedes when we're looking at it.
We're gonna need full forensics on this.
I know I need to call out our crime scene investigators, and they're gonna focus on looking for fingerprints. They're gonna swab inside the car for DNA. They're gonna swab outside the car for DNA. The shooting happened around 11:23 p.m. and the area is starting to slow down about that time on a Wednesday night. However, there were several witnesses that were lingering around and we were able to follow up with.
Did you see what happened here tonight?
I did identify a witness who had actually been walking by the Mercedes when the gunshot went off. He saw a subject approach the driver's side window of the Mercedes. He was wearing a yellow reflective vest like a security guard, and that he thought he heard something along the lines of the security guard asking the driver of the Mercedes for a smoke. One witness identifies a black male. I wasn't able to find any witnesses who had a very clear view of the suspect's face, and I certainly didn't have any witnesses that could pick him out of a lineup.
Okay, thank you.
I know that this is a large area with multiple sources for surveillance video. Video could be really helpful for us to understand and see exactly the circumstances of the shooting. It helps us get to the clues faster. Based on looking where the vehicle had crashed into the tree, I believe that the car had come from a parking spot directly in front of the Mini Mart.
All right, your camera's working? Yeah? I need to see him.
I spoke with a clerk who worked inside of the Mini Mart. He allowed me quick access to a surveillance camera that he had inside of his store. There's so many different sources that we could get video from, and that's exactly why we have a team of digital media specialists that can respond to these scenes. I'm now thinking I've got to get Specialist Meyer involved in this.
We got to the Mini Mart. The owner had left us, basically said, y'all are gonna be here all night, use my store. Here's the camera system. The main view that we were able to use to see the most was actually inside the store, kind of overlooking the register. You could see out front to where people would be driving or parking in front of the store. And that was the best view that we had.
Okay, let's go back to about 8 p.m., see if we can spot the car. That's our clerk. No car. Well, that's the car. Okay, play it.
And at 8:59 p.m., a few hours before the murder, we can see Stephen's white Mercedes pull up and park directly here in front of the Mini Mart. Just sits there for a moment.
What's he doing?
We're waiting. Who's going to be getting out of this car, or are they going to be meeting anybody?
Who's this?
At approximately 9:01 p.m., we do see a female approach the vehicle.
She walked up towards the car like she was waiting for someone, and then walked out of camera frame towards the restaurants around the corner.
We then see that one individual gets out of the Mercedes from the driver's seat.
Can you zoom in? Freeze it there.
He's wearing this orange cap and a white jacket, and this cap does look consistent to what I'd seen inside of the vehicle.
That's gotta be Steve. Keep lying.
I'm piecing together the timeline of Steven. What time does he arrive? Who does he meet? Where does he go? Does he have any negative contacts that could have led to a conflict? The view from inside the mini mart is pretty limited, so we're not able to see everything once the driver gets out.
It's just not a good angle.
My team's looking for other cameras. Let's see what they've got.
Specialist Meyer actually got access to a security camera from the property management outside of the mini mart.
Hey, good news.
And it is covering and looking down exactly where the murder happened.
So this camera view showed what the mini mart's cameras didn't.
Benzik and Meyer head to the property management office to review the camera footage.
Okay. Let's start when Steven gets out of the car.
We go to around 9:01 p.m. We're able to see that, yes, that is Steven who gets out of the driver's door of the Mercedes, and that he is, in fact, meeting the female associate who walked up earlier.
They were having a conversation, and then they walk off together out of camera view.
Rewind, freeze on her.
Was she the last person with Steven? Could she have had anything to do with Steven's death? Or could she just be a witness that could really help us with the investigation?
Okay, let's spin forward to the time of the 911 call, around 11 p.m.
About 2 hours later, about 11:10 p.m., we see Steven and the female associate approaching from the direction that they had walked off to.
Freeze it there.
She's carrying like a to-go cup and a to-go bag from a restaurant.
Keep playing.
They walk past Steven's car. They're comfortable with each other.
Let's take to a few minutes just before the time of the 911 call.
There's about 13 minutes of time that elapsed before we then see Steven walking back to his car, and he's by himself this time. And he gets inside and shuts the door. And then just moments later, you do see an individual wearing a reflective security guard jacket, and he is approaching the car in the driver's side window. The security guard is intentionally trying to get Steven's attention. Steven does just roll down his window and talk to the security guard. The security guard then pulls a gun, steps towards him, and fires a single shot.
That's when he shot.
Steven's car, which must have been placed in drive by Steven prior, continues to drive forward and crashes into the tree. After that single shot is fired, the suspect turns and runs away, and I can see him fleeing on foot, running straight to the north.
Okay. Play it again. Let's see if we can find out who this guy is.
He's wearing the yellow reflective vest. He appears to be wearing a black hoodie. He's wearing black pants as well as black shoes.
Stop it there. Can you zoom in on him? Is he wearing a mask?
I think so.
The man had some object covering his face, which made it where you couldn't readily identify exactly who he was.
Okay, let's go back earlier in the evening when Steven parks the car. See if we can find this guy.
Copy that.
We were able to see that this person was in the area earlier in the evening. He's there for like 2 hours. Just a little loop between the mini mart and the victim's car.
Can you zoom in?
Mm-hmm. And you can see the word security on the back of his jacket. Holy cow, we've got a security guard gone rogue. What in the world would make him target this guy?
Benzik? Yep. Oh.
I did receive a phone call from the detectives at the hospital. Stephen Gambles had succumbed to his wounds.
Okay. Thank you. You didn't make it?
We're now working a homicide. The stakes are high now. Who is responsible for this murder? How do we go from a security guard patrolling the property to now murdering in cold blood? This doesn't make any sense at all.
While Benzik and Meyer work to identify the suspect, investigators visit Stephen's home.
When detectives responded to the last known address for Stephen Gambles, we made contact with his brother Marcus. Marcus had been visiting from out of town for the past few days. Stephen's parents lived out of town. Marcus, he's immediately calling them.
Hey, Skrill, what's happening? Skrill, that's the nickname I call him. I said, what are you doing? You know I'm at work. He said, Mom, no. He said, my brother is gone. My brother is dead. But of course, I lost it. What on earth are you talking about? Because I just talked to Stephen.
So I could tell in his voice that it was something catastrophic. So immediately I'm on the way, I catch a flight, but I want to know what had happened to my son.
The investigators work on tracing the security guard in the surveillance footage.
We have a suspect wearing the security guard jacket. So I'm focusing, could this be as simple as the security guard who is assigned to this neighborhood is in fact the person who committed the offense? I reached out to the officers who work in that neighborhood and I asked them, all right, is there a security company that works in this area? And they let me know that Gold Fortress Security does provide coverage in that area.
This is Detective Benzik, Plano PD.
And on the night Stephen was murdered, they did have a security guard working on the property. They identified the guard as Dominic Gatlin.
What time was that?
One of the logs indicated that shortly after 11 p.m., short time period before the murder, the security guard had checked in at a business about 100 meters from where the murder happened.
But police were unable to locate the security guard when they arrived on scene.
When did you last speak to him?
And we had the supervisor for Gold Fortress Security call out to that security guard and ask, hey, why aren't you out on property? The police are there, there's been a shooting, we can't find you. And the security guard responded to, hey, I left after 11 o'clock, and oh, by the way, I quit my job.
Thank you for your help.
Why would a security guard, knowing he's assigned to that property on camera, commit a murder? So we absolutely needed to find him. The logs put him in the area, and now he's telling the supervisor, I quit my job? Suspicious. Myself and Detective Jones respond to Dominic's residence. It was about 30 minutes away down in Dallas. He is the security guard who was supposed to be on the property.
Hello, sir. You Dominic Gatlin?
Yeah, I am.
One of our officers called you last night. Yeah. We have a word with you about what happened?
He was cordial. He came out and spoke to us.
I have nothing to do with nothing. I don't know nothing.
Okay.
I have no beef with nobody.
Okay.
He denies knowing anything about the shooting, says that he didn't shoot anybody, and doesn't have any information for me in regards to who the shooter could be. I'm skeptical. I show him pictures of the surveillance video.
Oh man, I think I found you on video walking around, security guard out there. No, that's not me.
He said he is not the suspect in this murder.
Next up might be next week, Monday and Tuesday. I went to work and actually clocked in, and then I stayed there for a couple hours and I left.
Dominic had been doing a fraudulent scheme against his employer. He had been taking the work phone, and he would take it home to him in Dallas, 30 minutes away, and he would use the phone to remotely check into locations at the property while actually not being there. He actually wasn't on the property when the shooting happened. At that point, I'm able to fully rule out Dominic Gatlin. He's not my suspect, and I don't know who they are at all. So we're back to square one. And that involves surveillance video. That is our best witness that we have at the moment of who the suspect is and where they could have gone.
Investigators reanalyzed the surveillance footage of the shooting for clues that could reveal the suspect's identity.
Hello, Detective.
While Stephen and his female associate dinner together at a nearby restaurant, I'm able to see a lot of movements of the suspect as he's walking around doing his fake patrolling.
There he is again.
Around 10:42 p.m., he approaches Stephen Gamble's car, finds it unlocked, and he actually gets inside of the vehicle. You can see him appear to take something from the center console area of the car and place that inside of his jacket.
What's he got?
I don't know.
Can you zoom in? Can you see what he's taking?
No.
Keep playing.
A minute goes by. We see the suspect get out of the car, and he starts walking around again. A period of time later, the suspect revisits the car, and we can actually see him open up the back door handle. And he gets fully inside of the back seat and closes the door.
What's he looking for?
I'm watching to about 11:10 p.m.
Oh, God.
And then I'm startled. I see Stephen and his female associate, and they start walking down the sidewalk, approaching the vehicle. It was an absolute chilling moment knowing that the suspect is in the backseat of Stephen's car. It's about a minute goes by, and we see the suspect get out of the backseat of the car. He then proceeds to continue kind of trolling around the property, fixated on Stephen. This very well could have been a double homicide and not just one person. And I was super thankful that Stephen took the time to walk that female to her car. It was clear that Stephen had spent some time with the female, and we hadn't been able to identify her yet in the investigation, so we absolutely needed to talk to her.
The call list on Stephen's phone reveals her name.
We were able to identify the female as Chantel Finch, and we were able to go speak with her in person.
I did want to just kind of go over something to see if you could be helpful with us on something, okay? And I want to see if you recognize anyone in this picture.
Yes.
Okay. What do you recognize in that picture?
Myself, of course. Absolutely. And Tim.
She did confirm that that was in fact her in the video. Chantel described her relationship with Stephen, so they'd been friends for about a year, and that they would frequently go out to dinner together.
See, do you remember that night?
Yes,
Okay.
I do.
Where did y'all go out to eat that night?
Benihana's.
Okay. Do you guys have any problems with anybody?
No.
Any conflict at all that night?
No. Not between us, not with anybody else.
I did ask her if she had seen a security guard in the area.
I want to say I saw the attire, the outfit.
Okay.
I thought it was just, regular routine security, someone doing their job.
And after they had dinner together, Stephen walked her to her car, and she went home. There's not any additional clues of conversations that they had, anyone else that they had talked to. So at this point, we decided to break the news to her that Stephen had in fact been murdered and was dead. It was absolutely clear that she had no involvement in the murder of Stephen Gambles and had no information to provide.
The following day, Stephen's family arrives at the police department.
On Friday morning, I was able to meet Stephen's parents, Phyllis and Stephen, in person.
Thank you for coming in today. Let me update you on our investigation.
To learn, not only is my son dead, but he was shot and killed by a person that doesn't even know him. There's nothing I can say. This is my baby.
He asked us, if we knew of anybody that had a beef with him, or if anybody wanted to hurt him, or nobody.
I promise we will get justice for Stephen.
He said, I give you my word. I'm gonna find who did this.
Investigators switch gears. They gather the footage from dozens of surveillance cameras in a radius around the crime scene.
Surveillance video evidence is actually going to help us prove who the killer is. It's a very slow process of going through each of these cameras, eliminating possible paths, and realizing, okay, this path is the only path that the suspect could have gotten to. We'd see him fleeing on foot and believe he traveled north from the crime scene towards the area of apartment complexes.
Detectives secure the surveillance footage from the location.
Let's start just after the shooting and work our way back.
And all of a sudden, at 11:29 p.m., boom. We see a suspect running up the stairs to this complex. This could be the guy.
Okay, play that again. Freeze it, there.
The man's face isn't super clear on the camera, but I can tell that he is a black male. I can see that he had a backpack on his back. This man is wearing a black hoodie, he's wearing black shoes, but he's not wearing the security guard jacket and he's not wearing the black pants. Is this our killer? This timing of the suspect running up the stairs is absolutely matching the time that our killer would have made it to that area. I'm extremely elated at this moment. This person that I'm seeing on the camera, wow, this could be my suspect.
This person wasn't wearing the security jacket. But did he dump the jacket somewhere? Is it folded up in his backpack? We just didn't know.
Zooming in.
I spent some time looking at the hoodie that the man running up the stairs was wearing, and I could recognize that it was a Thrasher brand hoodie, which is a unique look. I do remember that there was a black hoodie being worn by the suspect during the murder. This person that I'm seeing on the camera, wow, if this is the killer and he's running upstairs to a second floor apartment, that means earlier in the night, he would have had to come down these stairs.
Let's keep going back and see when he leaves the building.
So then we keep rewinding.
Play it back.
And then shortly after 9 o'clock, Oh my gosh, eureka. We see a subject coming down the stairs. He's wearing a yellow security guard jacket. It is the jacket that our killer is wearing later in the night.
That's gotta be him.
And at this moment, I know I have my killer identified on video.
Can you bring up the guy running up the stairs?
Absolutely.
He also has a backpack that has a distinct look to it, which matches the backpack that I see the man running up the stairs at 11:29 p.m. So what I'm understanding at that point is that we don't see the killer with the backpack on when the murder happens. It's highly likely that the suspect placed the backpack underneath the security guard jacket to alter his appearance.
Who is this guy?
At this point, I'm 100% confident that I have the killer on camera and that it is the same person running up the stairs wearing the Thrasher hoodie at 11:29 p.m. But putting a name to the killer is an absolute critical part of this investigation.
Investigators checked the police database for any recent contact between the building's residents and law enforcement. They discover a report of an altercation between a resident and her boyfriend.
We identified from that police report that a Jordan Jacobs had been connected to a domestic incident inside that building, along with the female Jasmine Brooks.
Can we see them?
Yep.
We're taking a look at what do they look like? Are they consistent with the person we see in the multiple surveillance videos?
Nice work.
Myself and Specialist Meyer are continuing. What else can we learn about people inside of the building?
What's that? Play it.
At 8:56 p.m., 2 hours before the murder happened, we see a male and a female walking down the stairs.
Freeze it.
We see that the male is wearing a black hoodie.
Keep playing.
10 minutes later, the surveillance camera captures the same couple and their dog as they return to the apartment building.
They're back.
The male is wearing a Thrasher hoodie. He appears to look directly at the surveillance camera.
Freeze it. Can you zoom in on his face?
Mm-hmm.
From that camera view with the male looking directly at the camera and the information that I had about research on Jordan Jacobs, I can definitively say he is Jordan Jacobs.
Investigators search for clues that connect Jordan Jacobs to Stephen's murder.
We learned that he and his girlfriend had prior employment for a company called Trident Security, and they provided pictures of the jackets that their officers wear. We were able to see that the surveillance video security guard jacket matched the actual Trident security jackets. Well, at this point, we're extremely confident Jordan Jacobs is our killer, but it still makes no sense. Why does he approach and kill Stephen Gamble?
I am screaming because I'm angry. Who is this person? Who came across my son and had that type of evil in them? He took Stephen's life.
As we're continuing to review the surveillance video, Jordan Jacobs and his girlfriend leave the apartment building for 10 minutes, several hours before the murder. And we're trying to focus, okay, where did they go during that time?
I think I've seen these two before. On the camera outside of the mini mart.
Let's play it.
Detective Jung actually makes the connection, and I completely missed this, but she pointed out that, hey, there is a man wearing a Thrasher hoodie walking directly by Stephen Gamble's when he first arrived to the property earlier that night.
At 8:59 p.m., Jasmine Brooke enters the Mini Mart, followed seconds later by Jordan Jacobs.
Incredible.
Jasmine and Jordan leave the store at 9:02 p.m. They walk towards Stephen Gamble's and his friend.
We now have our killer walking a few feet by Stephen Gamble's before he dies. It's still not answering the question of why did Jordan Jacobs go back and kill Stephen Gamble?
We've reviewed that footage a few times, looking for any kind of interaction between the two men. I don't even think there was a glance between them. They just passed each other.
We had our murderer on video the entire time and had no idea. My killer has a name. My killer is Jordan Jacobs, and we're gonna get him.
Plano PD SWAT swoops on the apartment building to arrest Jordan Jacobs.
We find him and his girlfriend, Jasmine Brooke, inside of a car in the parking lot. Our SWAT team is able to arrest Jordan Jacobs without incident. They take him into custody, and then he's transported to the Plano City Jail.
Can I confirm your first and last name?
Jordan Jacobs. They said there's a warrant for my arrest. I haven't did anything or anything. They got me mixed up because of another Jordan Jacobs.
Jordan immediately wants me to know that, hey, this could be some possible mix-up. He's had problems with other people using his name before, Jordan Jacobs, and maybe this is all just a big misunderstanding. And I know that's not the case.
You obviously recognize the female in the picture.
Yeah.
Okay. Who do you recognize that as?
My girlfriend.
That's your girlfriend. Okay. Do you recognize the person below in that picture?
That's me.
And he right away identifies himself. That's me. That's my girlfriend. So I'm getting that first affirmative link between Jordan Jacobs and the surveillance video and getting him confirming that with his own words.
Do you recognize that picture?
No.
Okay. Do you recognize that jacket?
I seen him walking around the apartment before. Last year.
Do you own a jacket like this?
No.
No?
Jordan denies that he's wearing the security guard jacket, says it's not him. And I don't get in an argument back and forth on whether it is him or not, because I already know at this point.
I've already identified that that's you wearing this jacket, walking around. I know it's you. I'm not doing that because I finished that part of the investigation.
I want to know what happened. Why did he kill Stephen Gamble's? What was said when Jordan approached that car?
You're just walking up to the side of a car. What happens? What's the dialogue? What is said, Jordan? What is this man telling you?
All I did was ask for a cigarette.
You want a cigarette?
And at that point in the interview, Jordan Jacobs acknowledged to me that he was in fact the killer, because that information was consistent with what the witness had described. He described hearing the killer in the jacket talk to Stephen Gamble's asking for a smoke. And you can start to see Jordan Jacobs slowly kind of realize that they've got me, and his tone kind of changes.
I'm done talking.
He says, I don't want to talk anymore. He's ending the interview. Detective Jung assisted in interviewing Jasmine Brooke and learning more information about what happened.
Do y'all go to that mini market?
Oh, yeah.
Over there? Do you remember the last night you went there?
Yeah. He got mad at me and left. Like, he made an argument up and left.
Did you remember what that argument was about?
I went to the store. It was a couple weeks. Jordan's very jealous. So he's like, you have people looking at you and stuff. And I'm like, what, dude?
And she didn't understand why Jordan Jacobs was trying to insinuate that somebody was looking at her inappropriately. She didn't see it that way at all. When they got back to the apartment, Jordan Jacobs told his girlfriend, I'm gonna give that man something to look at. I'm gonna go rob that man. Now we're understanding why Jordan Jacobs put on that security guard jacket. He had a plan. She did not know that someone had been murdered or killed, and was extremely cooperative in the investigation. And we don't find anything indicating that Jasmine was part of the actual murder offense, and we don't charge her with any criminal offenses.
Investigators secure a warrant to search Jordan Jacobs' residence.
We don't find the security guard jacket inside the apartment, but we do find some items that are very helpful in the investigation. That distinct backpack that Jordan Jacobs wore before and after the murder, we do in fact find the black hoodie with the Thrasher logo on the front. We learned that Stephen Gambles kept a handgun inside of that car. He kept a 9mm pistol inside the center console of his vehicle. It's no longer there after Stephen Gambles is murdered. With the supporting surveillance video, you can see Jordan Jacobs appear to take something from the center console area of the car and place that inside of his jacket, which leads us to believe that Stephen was murdered with his own gun that he kept inside of that car. And forensically, we were able to identify Jordan Jacobs' DNA was on the handle of Stephen Gamble's car.
On September 26, 2022, Jordan Jacobs stands trial for the murder of Stephen Gambles. Prosecutors describe what happened that night.
So on Wednesday, July 7th, 2021, Stephen Gambles went to the shops at Legacy to meet a female, Chantel, for dinner. It was just after 9 p.m. But before they made it to dinner, he was parked outside the Mini Mart. It was then that the chance interaction happened where Jasmine Brooke and her boyfriend, Jordan Jacobs, arrived at the Mini Mart. Jordan Jacobs decided that Stephen Gambles had looked at his girlfriend wrong. It upset him. It put him in a jealous rage. And so what is he gonna do? But he is gonna make that man pay for a simple look that a stranger gave his girlfriend. Jordan Jacobs and his girlfriend return to their apartment. He changes his clothes. He puts on his yellow security jacket, and he puts on a black medical mask and pulls the hoodie close up over his head. For the next couple hours, Jordan Jacobs stalks that victim's car. He tries the door handles. They're unlocked. He ultimately finds the 9mm Glock that Stephen had legal access to in his vehicle. When Stephen Gambles returns to his Mercedes, he's sitting in the driver's seat for just a matter of seconds before that man in the yellow security jacket is at his window. You see Jordan Jacobs raise that gun in his hand, point it directly at Stephen Gamble's head, and shoot him execution style.
Jordan Jacobs is found guilty of capital murder. He receives a life sentence without parole.
These pieces all came together and painted a picture for us that would have been extremely challenging without surveillance video.
Stephen was 32. Parents shouldn't have to bury their children. I miss everything about seeing my kid. I believe that in my son's 32 years, he lived full and died empty. And that's what I want people to remember.
I have so many beautiful, wonderful memories.
The freezing, rain-slicked concrete of a remote Pacific Northwest logging road in the late autumn of 1975 didn't look like the threshold of a generational nightmare, with its dense towering walls of Douglas firs, shifting gray-ground fog, and the desolate roar of the mountain river echoing through the valley. But beneath that pristine alpine surface lay a brutal, calculations-driven violence that was about to permanently shatter the innocence of a quiet timber community and plant a seed of structural terror that would mutate across 50 long years of total silence. It began on an icy November twilight when a 20-year-old university student, known for her sharp intellect, her quiet devotion to her family, and a predictable weekend routine of driving home from her campus dorm, stepped out of a brightly lit diner at the edge of the highway, adjusted her winter coat against the biting mountain wind, and vanished entirely into the dark without leaving a single footprint, a single drop of blood, or a single witness who could tell the frantic authorities which way the phantom had directed her path. Her vehicle was discovered hours later idling on the gravel shoulder of the logging route, its driver's side door flung wide open as an invitation to the abyss, its headlights cutting uselessly through the swirling fog banks while the windshield wipers scraped rhythmically against the dry glass, a mechanical baseline that timed the sudden, absolute erasure of a human life. There were no signs of a desperate struggle on the muddy shoulder, no torn fabric, no spent casings, just a half-written letter to her parents sitting on the passenger seat, its ink crisp, its narrative frozen mid-sentence like a permanent accusation against a law enforcement system that was about to break its mind trying to solve the riddle. Within hours, the local sheriff's department transformed the desolate stretch of highway into a high-intensity operational zone, their primitive red emergency beacons painting the wet pine needles in the shifting colors of a crime scene, their bloodhounds baying fiercely through the dense undergrowth while dive teams dragged the freezing black waters of the logging canals. It was a cold case born in the dark heart of the 70s, a psychological horror show that instantly turned longtime neighbors into suspicious adversaries, transformed every remote logging trail into a potential graveyard, and left an entire county paralyzed by an immediate, creeping dread that would choke the communal trust of the region for generations to come. The initial 72 hours of that 1975 investigation were a chaotic, analog race against a clock that refused to slow down, but the investigative tools of the era were devastatingly primitive, dependent on local landline relays, manual index card filing systems, and the limited, localized reach of evening radio bulletins that could do nothing to pierce the absolute silence of the mountain terrain. Detectives in heavy canvas coats moved yard by yard through the freezing brush, their flashlights casting long, frantic shadows through the timber as they bagged discarded cans, tire tracking prints, and cigarette filters, desperately seeking a single trace of biological identity that could give their phantom a physical shape and a name. The diner clerk, an exhausted woman whose hands shook as she recalled the final minutes of the twilight shift, could only describe a generic silhouette, a nondescript dark sedan that had been idling at the edge of the asphalt loop, its lights extinguished, its engine a low, rhythmic throb that vibrated through the glass windows of the shop before the girls stepped outside. Every lead followed by the early task force was a dead end that collapsed into thin air the moment investigators applied the pressure of validation. A transient rounded up near the train yards had an airtight alibi 3 counties away. A local logger with a history of disorderly conduct passed a grueling, analog polygraph test, and the initial list of campus acquaintances was systematically cleared after intense, late-night interrogations that yielded nothing but collective trauma. The case file grew rapidly, swelling into 3 massive cardboard boxes that sat on the sheriff's desk like a permanent monument to human failure, filled with hundreds of typed statements, false tips from desperate psychics, and thousands of pages of raw field notes that amounted to a mountain of data without a single gram of actionable forensic truth. As the months systematically turned into years, and the years dragged the community into the decade of the 1980s, the fiery intensity of the initial public outrage began to cool, replaced by a chronic, low-level static of fear that the town simply learned to integrate into its daily survival script. The local newspapers that had once splashed the victim's yearbook portrait across the front pages with bold, screaming headlines demanding immediate justice gradually moved the coverage to the interior columns, then to small, single-paragraph anniversary blurb updates, until finally, her name disappeared from print altogether, buried beneath the relentless, Don Dapp tide of new crimes, economic shifts, and the fast-paced transition into a modern world. But inside the family home, the silence was an active, suffocating predator, a physical weight that ground the parents down into dust over decades of unceasing, unresolved grief that offered no conclusion, no closure, and no definitive grave to weep over. The parents stayed in that house, refusing to change their phone number or move their furniture, clinging to an irrational, heartbreaking hope that one day the landline would ring and a voice would offer a confession or demand a ransom or simply provide the coordinates of a location where they could reclaim the physical remains of their child. The psychological torture of the unknown was a structural rot that destroyed the integrity of the household. The father spent his weekends walking the logging grids until his knees gave out, searching the drainage ditches and old timber cuts, driven by a primal necessity to find a shoe, a ring, or a fragment of bone that could break the stalemate before his own clock ran out. He passed away in 1989, his eyes holding a permanent, unhealable failure, leaving his wife to carry the heavy monument of their sorrow alone in a house that felt more like an archival vault than a home, while out in the woods, the rain continued to wash over the pine needles, burying the secrets of 1975 deeper into the damp, indifferent earth. The entry into the 1990s did not bring a sudden revelation to the silent timber country of the Pacific Northwest. It merely deepened the shadow that sat over the 1975 files, wrapping the unresolved tragedy in a thick, industrial layer of dust, bureaucracy, and fading memories. By the middle of that decade, the analog world that had shielded the predator was beginning to experience its first primitive digital upgrades, but inside the county sheriff's department basement, the file room remained a tomb of frozen time. The cardboard boxes containing the typed witness statements, the grainy Polaroids of the idling vehicle, and the half-written letter from the passenger seat sat on a rusted steel shelf, an orphan of a system that was constantly overwhelmed by the immediate, Don Dapp pressure of modern narcotics enforcement and suburban property crimes. The original detectives who had stood in the freezing mountain twilight of 1975 had all hung up their badges, their retirements marked by a quiet, professional shame that they carried into their personal lives like a terminal diagnosis, leaving behind a legacy of absolute frustration for a new generation of law enforcement officers who didn't even know how to navigate the analog indexing systems of the mid-70s. The geography of the county itself was undergoing a systematic, irreversible transformation. The old gravel logging roads were being widened and paved over by state highway crews. The dense stands of Douglas firs where the search dog units had bayed were being clear-cut to make room for rows of identical master-planned housing developments. And the old diner at the edge of the highway was torn down to install a corporate gas station chain with high-intensity LED lights and automated surveillance arrays that monitored every square inch of the concrete pit stop. To the new population of tech workers and commuters who were moving into the valley from Seattle, the highway loop was just a scenic route through the mountains, entirely devoid of historical context. But to the older generation of loggers and shopkeepers who remained, that stretch of asphalt was a permanent monument to a collective loss of structural innocence. The behavior of the town had permanently mutated. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam the mountain trails until dusk now enforced rigid, militaristic curfews, the simple, unthinking trust that had defined the timber community before 1975 replaced by a low-level, permanent paranoia that whispered that the ghost was still walking the perimeter, still waiting for the perfect second of vulnerability. The victim's mother had grown frail, her mind slowly hollowing out under the weight of an unceasing sorrow that offered no conclusion, her days spent in a rocking chair by the living room window, her eyes fixed on the empty driveway as if the hands of the clock could suddenly spin backward and return her daughter from the dark. When she passed away in the winter of 1998, the home was sold to a young family who had no knowledge of its internal history, the old floral wallpaper scraped away, the brass light fixtures replaced, effectively completing the physical erasure of the victim's presence from the town she had called home. Inside the precinct, the file was officially categorized as a cold case, a designation that practically served as an administrative death sentence, a formal filing away of a human tragedy into a category of permanent unresolvability, where folders go to sit until the paper becomes too brittle to handle, without protective gloves. The turn of the millennium arrived with a massive explosion of digital data tracking, the birth of national criminal databases and advanced forensic profiling networks that promised to bring a new level of scientific precision to the war against the dark. But for the 1975 mystery, these tools remained completely useless because of the devastating limitations of the early evidence collection. The physical items that had been secured from the muddy shoulder of the logging road, the discarded cans, the tire tracks preserved in plaster casts, and the clothing items retrieved from the vehicle, had been stored in a damp property locker that lacked the climate-controlled insulation required to protect biological evidence across 3 decades. When a young cold case investigator named Detective Raymond Miller pulled the boxes from the basement in 2005, determined to apply modern DNA testing methods to the file, he was met with a crushing, professional heartbreak. The paper baggies containing the clothing had been infected by black mold during a precinct basement flood in 1984. The genetic material degraded so significantly by time, moisture, and primitive handling that the state laboratory returned the samples with a clinical, definitive assessment that no clean short tandem repeat profile could ever be extracted from the material. The plaster casts of the tire tracks were chipped and cracked, their geometric contours blurred by decades of shifting weight in the evidence crates, leaving Miller with nothing but a mountain of analog data that had been stripped of its scientific utility, forcing him to stand in the exact same position of absolute helplessness that had broken the minds of his predecessors in the 70s. The psychological toll on Miller was immediate and profound. He found himself spending his off-duty hours sitting in the archive room under the harsh glare of the fluorescent tubes, rereading the handwritten field notebooks of the retired deputies, looking for a word, a punctuation mark, or a minor observation that could provide a new vector for investigation. He began to realize that the killer hadn't just escaped the dragnet through a stroke of luck or a technical loophole. He had operated with a terrifyingly clinical understanding of the law's limitations in 1975, utilizing the sprawling, unmonitored landscape of the Pacific Northwest Mountains to hide his identity behind a shield of absolute geographic chaos. The suspect pool remained a chaotic, unnavigable ocean of thousands of names. Every transient worker who had checked into a local motel that week, every truck driver who had logged miles on the interstate corridor, every local citizen with a record for minor traffic violations or public intoxication. The behavioral analysis units at the FBI could only offer a generic, macro-level profile of an organized offender with high situational awareness, a probable history of local residency, and a sophisticated capacity for social camouflage that allowed him to maintain a normal, law-abiding identity within his professional and family circles while carrying the memory of an execution beneath a smile of ordinary, everyday politeness. This profile was a terrifying abstraction that offered no direct path to an arrest warrant. It meant the monster could be anyone, a thread woven seamlessly into the fabric of the county, an individual who might be sitting next to you at a high school football game or serving you food at a local diner, entirely untouched by the hands of justice. By the time the 40th anniversary of the disappearance arrived in 2015, the case had achieved a legendary, mythical status within the regional law enforcement community, a classic textbook example of a total investigative vacuum, a dark puzzle where the passage of generations had successfully burned away all the human connections and physical traces that typically anchor a homicide file to reality. The internet had given rise to a vast, decentralized army of digital web sleuths who parse the few public details of the case on international true crime forums, spinning wild, unsubstantiated conspiracy theories about occult rituals in the mountains, high-level political cover-ups involving the local timber barons, and connections to notorious, multi-state serial killers who had operated in the region during the mid-70s. These digital discussions turned a raw, private family tragedy into a gamified puzzle of online speculation, generating a massive cloud of digital noise that only served to further obscure the simple, brutal reality of what had occurred on that icy shoulder of the logging road. Detective Miller had been promoted to captain, his active street days behind him, but the 1975 file remained a permanent fixture in his mind, an unresolved failure that haunted his professional conscience and made him review the old Polaroids in the quiet hours of the night before his own retirement slid into view, wondering if the dark had simply won a permanent victory over the light. But beneath the digital static of the internet and the generational shifts of the precinct, the physical world was quietly preparing a technological revolution that would completely reshape the boundaries of forensic possibility, an advancement that would look past the degraded mold of the property locker to find an answer written in the absolute baseline of human biology. In the spring of 2024, nearly half a century after the university students stepped out of the diner into the mountain fog, a small private biotechnology firm in California announced a major breakthrough in the extraction of single nucleotide polymorphism data from highly degraded, historical human remains and low copy number environmental samples that had previously been classified as forensic dead ends. The county sheriff's department, now under the leadership of a progressive administration determined to clear the ancient backlog of the cold case unit, authorized the release of the final, untested fragment of evidence from the 1975 file, a small, glass slide containing a microscopic cellular sample that had been scraped from the steering wheel of the victim's vehicle during the initial dawn sweep and preserved in a wax sealant that had accidentally protected it from the 1984 basement flood. The sample was carefully packed into a secure, temperature-regulated container and shipped under a strict chain of custody to the California facility, a clinical operation that represented the absolute final roll of the dice for a case that had successfully resisted every other human effort for 50 long years. The 6 months that followed the shipment of the slide were a period of intense, agonizing suspension for the cold case detectives who held the keys to the archival vault, their daily routines continuing around the modern noise of the precinct while their professional focus remained locked on the encryption portals of the genomics lab. They knew that if this final attempt came back negative, if the wax sealant had failed or the cellular sample was too contaminated by the handling of the early 70s deputies to yield a clean genomic sequence, the 1975 file would be permanently closed, consigned to the status of an eternal mystery, a historical scar that the county would simply have to carry forever into the dark. The tension within the unit was a physical pressure, a tightening in the chests of investigators who knew they were standing on the absolute knife edge between a miraculous, historic breakthrough and a definitive, crushing defeat that would finalize the Predator's victory across time and space. Outside the precinct walls, the modern timber towns of the Northwest continued their fast-paced, indifferent hustle, the new generations entirely unaware that the ghost of the 1975 logging road was currently being decoded atom by atom in a sterile, ultra-modern laboratory 1,000 miles away, its hidden lineage mapped out through a vast digital matrix of biological data that left no room for performance, camouflage, or silence. The notification that the genomic sequencing had reached absolute stabilization arrived on a frozen Tuesday morning in October 2024, popping up on the monitor of the cold case unit as a simple, uncolored hyperlink that belied the world-shaking nature of the data waiting behind the encryption wall. The supervisor didn't summon the field team. He sat alone in his office with the shades pulled down against the pale northern sun, his hand freezing on the mouse as he entered his security credentials to unlock the multi-page PDF report generated by the genomics firm in California. The lab had managed a forensic miracle, extracting a pristine, undegraded profile from the single nucleotide polymorphisms locked within the wax-sealed slide, a biological blueprint that did not contain a direct name but instead offered a massive, sprawling list of genetic connections to living citizens who had uploaded their data to global public ancestry platforms. This was the birth of the digital dragnet, the opening movement of a high-tech siege that was about to strip a ghost of his 50-year-old anonymity through the slow, mathematical mapping of his own family lineage across 2 centuries of American history. The investigative genealogy phase was an exhausting, monastic campaign that took place entirely behind closed doors, a process that felt more like a study of historical migrations than a traditional police manhunt. 2 specialized genetic analysts were brought in from the state capitol, their twin monitor desks covered in digital census charts, military draft records, marriage certificates, and old obituary columns, all linked together by an intricate, chaotic matrix of digital red string. They were looking for a specific, razor-sharp intersection of biology, geography, and chronology, a male descendant within that massive genetic tree who was between the ages of 20 and 35 in November 1975, who had a verifiable connection to the timber valleys of the Pacific Northwest, and who had access to a vehicle capable of navigating the rugged gravel logging routes of the county. For weeks, the analysts chopped away at the branches of the family tree, systematically eliminating entire lineages because they had remained in the American South, or because the sons had been deployed overseas in the military during the tail end of the Vietnam era, or because they were serving time in federal penitentiaries when the university's student vanished into the mountain fog. The noose began to tighten with an intense, dawn-dap rhythm as the family tree was pruned down from thousands of names to a single, distinct lineage that had migrated from the mining towns of Pennsylvania to the timber country of Washington and Oregon in the late 1960s. The analysts focused their scrutiny on two brothers from this lineage, men who had been in their mid-20s during the winter of 1975, individuals who worked in the heavy logging and land surveying industries, trades that gave them an intimate, unrestricted knowledge of the remote backcountry roads and the unmonitored boundary lines of the state timber reserves. One brother had been killed in an industrial accident at a lumber mill in 1982, his secrets buried with him in a moss-covered plot near the river, but the second brother, the youngest, had survived, moving through the decades with a quiet, calculated normalcy that had kept his name entirely clear of the sheriff's department intelligence logs for half a century. He was still there, living less than 40 miles from the gravel shoulder where the idling vehicle had been discovered with its headlights cutting through the fog banks 35 years before. The target had a physical form now, an address, a driving record, and a face that could be pulled from the digital archives of the Department of Motor Vehicles, a face that had aged, wrinkled, and grayed under the damp northern sky, but still possessed the sharp, deep-set eyes that matched the psychological profile of an organized, clinical offender. The Cold Case Unit launched a covert intelligence operation, mapping his daily movements, his financial transactions, his social circles, and his routine habits with a level of surveillance that was surgical in its precision, ensuring that not a single ripple in the neighborhood pool would alert the target to the closure of the net. He was a great-grandfather now, a retired land surveyor who lived in a modest, cedar-sided cabin at the edge of a quiet lake, a man viewed by his neighbors as a harmless, eccentric fixture of the rural community, someone who spent his days fishing for trout and repairing old wooden boats in his garage. The cognitive dissonance was a sickening, toxic pressure in the stomachs of the investigators who sat in unmarked utility vehicles at the edge of the lake road, watching him carry bags of birdseed to his porch or teach his great-grandson how to tie a fishing knot, knowing that beneath that veneer of grandfatherly peace lay the unexorcised shadow of a violent execution that had frozen a community in fear for 50 years. The operation demanded a direct, uncontaminated sample of his DNA to validate the genealogical match before an arrest warrant could be signed, a task that required absolute tactical patience to prevent the suspect from realizing he was under scrutiny and destroying potential secondary evidence or taking his own life to escape the public exposure of his past. The surveillance teams tracked him to a local hardware store where he bought supplies every Wednesday morning, watching his movements through high-powered long lenses from across the logging highway, waiting for the precise second he would discard a coffee cup, a tissue, or a cigarette filter onto the concrete of the parking lot. The tension during these surveillance shifts was an active, suffocating current. The detectives knew that a single miscalculation, an unfamiliar vehicle lingering too long on the narrow lake road, or a sudden movement by an operator could tip off a man who had successfully managed a monstrous secret for more than half his life. On the fourth week of the operation, the suspect stepped out of a diner near the lumber yards, paused on the gravel shoulder to light a pipe, took 3 long draws, and used a small wooden toothpick to clean his pipe stem before tossing the fragment of wood into a public waste bin near the gas pumps and climbing into his pickup truck to drive back toward the lake. The recovery of the toothpick was a frantic, low-profile scramble. An investigator in civilian clothing stepped out of an unmarked van with a pair of forensic tweezers and a sterile collection bag, retrieving the discarded sliver of wood from the interior of the bin before the morning humidity could degrade the epithelial cells left on the surface by the suspect's mouth. The sample was rushed to the state crime laboratory under an emergency prioritization protocol, the technicians working through the night under the glare of modern fluorescent lamps to extract the short tandem repeat profile that would either validate the months of genealogical research or smash the unit's hopes into 1,000 pieces. The supervisor did not leave the facility. He slept on a folding cot in the record room, his dreams a chaotic montage of 1975 crime scene sketches, the sound of windshield wipers scraping against dry glass, and the wrinkled, graying face of the land surveyor who lived by the lake. At 3:15 a.m., the lead forensic technician tapped on the glass of the office door, a computerized printout in her hand, her face completely pale, her eyes reflecting the absolute, historical weight of the data she was holding. The match was a 1-to-1, mathematically irrefutable confirmation. The DNA extracted from the discarded wooden toothpick was an identical match to the biological profile recovered from the wax-sealed slide that had sat in the property room since the winter of 1975, a probability of a random match calculated at 1 in several trillion. The phantom had a body, the ghost had a name, and the cold case that had broken 3 generations of law enforcement officers was no longer an unsolved riddle. It was a pending arrest operation that would tear the heart out of the town's carefully constructed normalcy. The supervisor sat at his desk in the pre-dawn dark, the printout under the pool of his desk lamp, looking at the name of the suspect, realizing that the long, historical arc of justice had finally caught up to the monster through the slow, relentless, and unbribable march of modern evolutionary science. The warrant was drafted before the sun cleared the mountain peaks, the signatures obtained from a superior court judge who had been a young law student when the university student vanished, his hand shaking slightly as he pressed the official state seal into the parchment, signaling the end of the waiting and the beginning of the reckoning. The logistics of the arrest were planned with the tactical precision of a military raid, a multi-agency mobilization that involved the county SWAT team, state investigators, and federal observers, all converging on the Quiet Lake property at 5:30 a.m. on a Friday morning. The objective was to breach the cedar cabin and secure the suspect before he had the opportunity to access the hunting rifles he kept registered to his name, or to turn a weapon on himself to cheat the executioner out of a formal, public accounting before a jury of his peers. The unmarked vehicles parked down the logging lane, their lights blacked out, the operators in full tactical gear moving through the heavy ground fog with a silent, fluid motion of shadow puppets against the gray gravel of the driveways. The lead detective stood near the perimeter, his hand on his sidearm, his mind flashing back to the fading, missing poster that still hung on the archive wall at the precinct, thinking of the mother who had died in her rocking chair, thinking of the father who had walked the timber grids until his knees gave out, realizing that the silence of 50 years was about to be broken by the loudest sound in the history of the county. The breach was sudden, violent, and absolute, the flashbangs illuminating the interior of the cedar cabin with a brief, white-hot intensity that shattered the early morning stillness, the commands of the operators echoing through the timber, like thunder, as they cleared the rooms yard by yard. The suspect was found in his kitchen, a man caught between the ordinary routine of making coffee and the terrifying realization that his 50-year run had reached its terminal point, his hands pinned behind his back by the heavy plastic flex cuffs before he could even register the reality of the intrusion. He didn't scream, he didn't fight, he didn't offer a single word of protest. He sat on a wooden chair in his undershirt, his gray hair wild, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the floor with a dull, hollow stare that seemed to acknowledge that the past had finally arrived to collect its debt. As they let him out of the cabin into the cool morning air, the neighbors were standing on their porches in their bathrobes, their faces twisted in absolute, paralyzed shock as they watched the quiet land surveyor from down the lane being loaded into the back of an armored transport vehicle, the red and blue emergency lights painting the dark pine trees in the shifting colors of a crime scene. The transport vehicle tore through the mountain highway toward the county jail, its tires screaming against the asphalt, the radio static a constant hum in the cabin as the team radioed in the successful securement of the target, but inside the rear compartment, the suspect remained a monument to a profound, chilling silence. He looked out the reinforced glass window at the passing landscape, at the modern subdivisions, the digital billboards, and the corporate gas stations that had been built over the clear cuts of his youth, his expression completely unreadable, a man who had outlived his era but could no longer outrun his guilt. The lead detective sat across from him, his notebook open, his pen ready, waiting for the first crack in the facade, the first indication that the monster of 1975 was ready to speak, to explain the inexplicable, or to provide the location of the final, missing truth that the town had been searching for since the heat of that long-forgotten winter. The air inside the vehicle was thick, suffocating with a scent of old sweat, ozone, and the invisible, crushing gravity of a historical reckoning that was half a century in the making. The concrete walls of the county jail's intake corridor felt less like a modern processing center and more like a subterranean vault designed to lock away the remnants of a past that the world had spent half a century trying to forget. The fluorescent fixtures overhead hummed with a low, parasitic vibration that set a clinical tone for the bureaucratic ritual unfolding beneath their harsh, white glare, a space where the noise of the regional highway died a sudden death against 3 feet of reinforced steel. The suspect sat on a welded iron bench, his wrists secured to a heavy leather transport belt that kept his calloused, wrinkled hands pinned flat against his lap, his crimson administrative segregation uniform hanging loosely off a frame that had been built by decades of heavy timber work. The booking process moved with a rhythmic, robotic precision. The clack of the digital fingerprint scanner, the sudden strobe of the mugshot camera, the cold inventory of his personal effects, every step a systematic peeling away of the harmless country craftsman identity he had carefully cultivated on the bones of a dead girl. Outside the facility, the digital universe was already vibrating with the dawn-dap energy of a historic revelation, the news of the arrest breaking through the modern media networks with the force of an explosive surge that turned the entire logging valley into a chaotic hornet's nest of speculation. 1975 Cold Case Solved, Forensic Genealogy Unearths Dark Legacy was the title that dominated the regional news feeds. The old, grainy high school graduation photograph of the university student placed side by side with a raw, hollow-eyed mugshot of the retired land surveyor. The contrast was a visceral, physical shock to the public system. It forced a generation that had integrated the old mystery into the folklore of the mountains to confront the reality that the phantom hadn't been a nomadic specter who had long since vanished from the state, but a neighbor who had watched their community grow while carrying the memory of an execution beneath his smile. The phone lines at the sheriff's precinct were jammed with calls from national news centers, from old classmates of the victim who were now great-grandparents themselves, and from residents of the Lake Development who were frantically reviewing their own memories, wondering if every shared tool, every pleasant wave across the water, and every quiet conversation over the fence had been a performance designed to keep the dark hidden from the light. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was entirely divorced from the frantic noise of the media circus outside, a quiet, windowless cube where the air was thick with the scent of ozone, stale black coffee, and the heavy, invisible pressure of a lifetime of deception waiting to be shattered by the tools of modern science. The suspect sat at the center of the metal table, his gaze fixed on the reflection of his own wrinkled face in the one-way glass, a man who looked as though he were staring at a stranger he had spent 50 years running from through the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. Captain Miller and the lead prosecutor entered the room without the traditional folders or investigative binders, carrying only the absolute certainty of the DNA match that sat on the secure server in the next office, their movements slow, deliberate, and entirely calm as they established a professional intimacy that left no room for the suspect to retreat behind his mask of rural innocence. Miller laid the printout of the genomic sequencing match on the metal table, the numbers and statistical percentages under the harsh fluorescent light looking like an unbribable mathematical sentence from which there was no appeal, a scientific execution that rendered all his decades of silence completely useless. 50 years, Arthur, Miller said, his voice a low, steady rumble that filled the small room like a gathering storm. 50 years you repaired those wooden boats, you taught your grandkids how to fish, you watched the sun set over that lake, and you thought the winter rain had washed that logging road clean forever. But the science doesn't lie, it doesn't forget, and it doesn't care about your performance. The suspect didn't look up. His eyes remained glued to the printout, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged, the sound of his lungs a dry. Paper rasped against the quiet of the room as the reality of his total exposure began to crush the final structural remnants of his psychological defense. The silence that followed was a physical entity, a stretching, agonizing expanse of time where the ticking of the digital clock on the wall felt like a rhythmic hammer strike against the suspect's sanity, forcing him to choose between a useless, desperate denial and the ultimate, explosive release of the truth. His fingers twitched against the metal ring of the handcuffs, a small, metallic clink that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, a sign that the integrity of his secret was fracturing from the inside out under the weight of the evidence. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence, his head slowly rising until his deep-set, gray eyes met those of the investigator, eyes that were no longer those of a harmless retired craftsman, but the cold, haunted eyes of the man who had stepped out of the shadows of the Douglas firs in November 1975. I always knew when the technology started changing that the Earth wouldn't keep her secret forever, the suspect whispered, his voice thin, dry, and ancient, the sound of a gate opening after half a century of rust and neglect, a voice that carried the freezing, damp air of that long-forgotten twilight straight into the sterile warmth of the modern precinct. Every time I saw a news report about DNA, every time a police cruiser slowed down near the Lake Lane, I felt a tightening in my chest, the feeling that the world was catching up to me, that the modern world was rebuilding the past atom by atom, and that there wasn't a forest deep enough left to hide what happened on that road. The admission was a shockwave that hit the investigators with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, blinding confirmation that the phantom was real, that the confession was coming, and that the long, dark winter of the county's greatest mystery was about to dissolve into a horrifying cascade of truth. The suspect didn't stop. Once the first brick had been removed from the dam, the confession became an uncontrollable, Don-Dap torrent of words, a clinical, terrifyingly detailed reconstruction of a crime that had been preserved in his memory with a pristine, horrific clarity across 50 years of conformity. He spoke of the freezing rain of that November night, the way the headlights of his old sedan had illuminated the ground fog rolling off the mountain river, and the sudden, predatory impulse that had overtaken him when he saw her vehicle pull away from the diner, a target of pure, random opportunity that had crossed his path at the absolute worst second of her life. He described the abduction not as a monster, but as a technician describing a mechanical process, detailing the way he had staged a breakdown on the logging road, the specific grip he had used to silence her screams when she stepped out to help, and the absolute precision with which he had driven her vehicle away into the deep, unmonitored dark of the timber cuts before the town could even register her absence. The details were a series of hammer blows that turned the air in the interrogation room to ice. He knew the contents of the half-written letter on the passenger seat. He knew the color of the winter coat she had worn, and he knew the specific, broken phrase she had whispered as the car sped toward the abandoned logging trails of the high ridge where the tree line met the sky. The investigators sat completely motionless, their breath shallow, their pens untouched, realizing that they were listening to the definitive script of a tragedy that had been written in blood half a century ago, a script that had remained hidden behind a mask of rural respectability while a family rotted away from grief. The contrast between his ordinary appearance and the casual, matter-of-fact delivery of his violence was a psychological horror that made the skin crawl, a realization that the barrier between normalcy and absolute monstrosity is nothing more than a thin, fragile thread of human choice. He described the final moments on the high ridge with an unflinching, chilling detachment, recounting the way the mountain wind had howled through the pines like a choir of ghosts, and the absolute silence of the wilderness that had swallowed her final, desperate pleas for mercy before the blow was struck. She asked about her dad. The suspect said, his eyes staring through the investigator as if he were looking back through the decades, back to that patch of damp earth where the ground fog had rolled over the boots of his younger self. She told me her dad was waiting for her, that she was supposed to be home for dinner, but the dark had already won, you see. Once you step across that line on a deserted mountain road, there is no going back, there is no undoing the choice. You just have to finish what you started and try to find a way to live with the noise in your head for the next 50 years. The confession was a structural demolition of the town's past, a brutal, unredacted truth that left no room for the myths, the web sleuth theories, or the comforting illusions that the crime had been committed by a nomadic serial killer who had long since left the state. The monster was local, he was permanent, and he was sitting in a pair of plastic slides in a county jail, unburdening himself of a weight that had become too heavy for his aging body to carry into the grave before the law could claim its debt. The prosecutor stepped out of the interrogation room into the hallway, his face completely drained of color, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone to call the state attorney general, realizing that the narrative was complete. The case was airtight, but the victory felt like a heavy, cold stone sitting in the center of his chest. The confession was not an ending. It was the beginning of a deeper, more agonizing excavation of the county's history, as the suspect began to provide the precise landmarks and geographical coordinates of the location where he had left the physical remains of his crime, a spot deep within an old timber cut that had since been designated as a state reforestation zone. The mapping of the recovery site was a grim, bureaucratic operation that would begin at dawn, a mobilization of forensic anthropologists, state surveyors, and heavy machinery that would have to tear into the pristine earth of the Pacific Northwest wilderness to reclaim what had been hidden for 50 years. The town outside was settling into the evening, the streetlights flickering to life along the highway loop, entirely unaware that the final, darkest chapter of their shared biography was currently being typed into an official police transcript in the basement of the precinct, a document that would change the way they looked at their mountains forever. The dawn that followed the confession did not break with the usual crisp, golden clarity of a Pacific Northwest autumn. It arrived as a flat, suffocating wall of slate-gray moisture that hung low over the timber ridges, trapping the scent of damp pine needles, wet clay, and industrial exhaust against the earth. Long before the first logging trucks began their daily crawl down the mountain highway, a solemn caravan of unmarked state vehicles, utility trucks, and an armored forensic command unit pulled out of the precinct's rear gate, moving with a synchronized, ghostly silence toward the eastern edge of the county. In the center of the convoy sat a transport van carrying the suspect, now a primary guide in his own historical excavation, stripped of his civilian clothes and forced into a high-visibility restraint harness that clinked rhythmically against the steel floorboards with every turn of the wheels. The destination was an isolated, densely overgrown tract of the state reforestation zone, a prehistoric landscape of ancient stumps, decaying deadfall, and thick devil's club that had stood largely undisturbed since the heavy machinery of the timber companies had pulled out of the sector in the late 70s. For 50 long years, this specific patch of mountain wilderness had been a blind spot on the map of human justice, a protected zone where the changing seasons did nothing but pile layer upon layer of rotting vegetation, moss, and silt over the secrets of November 1975. As the vehicles parked along the mudslick shoulder of a long-abandoned logging trail, the heavy doors swung open, and the absolute silence of the backcountry swallowed the click of boots and the low murmur of tactical radios. The team was composed of veteran homicide investigators, forensic anthropologists from the State University, and a recovery crew equipped with ground-penetrating radar, specialized screens, and hand tools designed for the surgical dissection of the earth. The suspect was led to the front of the line, his frame looking remarkably frail beneath the towering canopy of Douglas firs that hung over the trail like a tattered burial shroud, his eyes scanning the thick undergrowth with a dull, clinical familiarity that turned the stomachs of the men who walked behind him. He paused at the edge of a deep, moss-covered ravine where a seasonal mountain creek cut through the glacial till, his breathing heavy and ragged in the cold, moisture-laden air, his cuffed hand rising slowly to point toward a small, natural depression tucked behind a fortress of ancient cedar roots and decaying logs. "Right here," he whispered, his voice barely cutting through the relentless, low-pitched rush of the water below. The old skid trail used to cut in right through those hemlocks, before the state put up the boundary gates and the secondary growth choked the clearing. I backed the truck in until the tailgates touched the ferns, and I used a surveyor's spade to break the clay beneath the root structure before the ground could freeze for the winter. The statement was dropped into the forest like a heavy stone. the reality of his memory so precise, so undegraded by the passage of half a century, that it felt as though the hands of the clock had been violently spun backward, forcing every investigator present to stand in the terrifyingly immediate presence of the 1975 crime scene. The forensic anthropologists moved in with the quiet, methodical grace of clinical executioners, immediately clearing the surface brush with hand shears, laying out a grid of bright yellow string that carved the forest floor into a precise matrix of square meters. Every square was a chapter, every inch of topsoil a repository of decades of ecological history that would have to be peeled back grain by grain, root by root, to find what the Earth had spent half a lifetime digesting. The ground-penetrating radar units were rolled across the uneven terrain, their digital screens throwing back chaotic, high-contrast waveforms of density anomalies buried beneath the deep root structures, mapping the hidden contours of a subterranean world that had remained undisturbed since the heat of that long-forgotten winter. The air in the clearing became thick with the smell of rich, rotting peat and wet clay as the recovery crew dropped to their knees, using small trowels and brushes to sift through the first layers of organic decay, their faces grim, their focus absolute, knowing that a single reckless strike of a shovel could destroy the fragile, biological evidence they had spent 50 years hunting. Inside the command van, the supervisor sat before a wall of monitors, his eyes fixed on the live video feeds from the grid cameras, his mind operating with a cold, analytical detachability that was the only defense against the radioactive intensity of the scene unfolding yards away. He was watching the slow, agonizing transformation of a local myth into a physical coordinates, a process that felt less like a police operation and more like a historical exhumation of the county's collective trauma. On the radio speaker, the low-frequency static of the field teams was a constant, rhythmic hum, interrupted only by the brief, clinical updates from the anthropologists as they documented the recovery of secondary artifacts, buttons that had survived the high acidity of the forest soil, fragments of synthetic fabric that had resisted the decomposition of the bog, and the rusted remnants of metal snaps that matched the historical inventory of the winter coat worn by the victim on the night of her disappearance. The progression through the soil was a journey through time itself, each layer of silt representing years of local rainfall, alpine snowstorms, and the silent, slow-motion crawl of the northwest wilderness reclaiming its territory from the infrastructure of human expansion. By mid-afternoon, the temperature in the ravine had dropped significantly, a heavy, wet fog rolling down from the high ridges that made it difficult to breathe, the mud clinging to the boots of the investigators like wet cement as they worked deeper into the secondary stratum of the grid. The suspect had been moved back to the secure interior of a transport vehicle, his silhouette visible through the tinted glass, a quiet, motionless spectator to the destruction of his own dark legacy, his face completely devoid of expression as he watched the tools of science dismantle the anonymity he had traded his soul to maintain. The absolute lack of remorse radiating from his form was a psychological weight that hung over the entire clearing, a reminder that the man they had arrested wasn't a broken penitent seeking redemption, but a defeated predator whose cage had simply grown too tight to fight his way out. At exactly 3:42 p.m., a sudden, sharp silence fell over Grid Square 4, a freezing of motion that caught the attention of every camera operator and investigator within the perimeter as the lead anthropologist raised a single, gloved hand to signal a complete halt to the machinery. She dropped lower into the trench, her brush moving with microscopic precision across a shelf of gray clay, clearing away a pocket of dark water until a pale, distinct curve appeared against the dark texture of the earth, a fragment of human bone, perfectly preserved by the anaerobic environment of the deep woods, a silent, indisputable witness that had finally broken its 50-year silence. The supervisor stepped out of the command van into the heavy air of the clearing, his heart striking against his ribs with a slow, heavy rhythm as he walked toward the edge of the yellow string, looking down into the pit at the definitive, structural proof of a monstrous execution that could no longer be denied, covered up, or forgotten by the passage of time. The recovery process shifted into an even higher tier of meticulous precision, the anthropologists working with dental picks and fine matted brushes to expose the remaining fragments of the skeletal structure, documenting the spatial orientation of every element with laser scanners to reconstruct the exact position of the body at the moment of burial. It was a clinical resurrection of a tragedy, a process that stripped away the abstract horror of the case and replaced it with the cold, hard, and undeniable language of skeletal trauma, revealing the true, unrestricted violence of the suspect's final actions in the woods. They found the fractures that spoke of a desperate, futile struggle for life against a physical force that was calculated, overwhelming, and utterly merciless. They found the biological signature of a predator who had chosen a location precisely because the silence of the landscape would drown out any cry for assistance. The news of the recovery site's discovery leaked out into the timber towns with the speed of an electric current, the rumors turning into a physical presence as local news helicopters began to circle high above the tree line of the reforestation zone, their telephoto lenses trained on the yellow canopies and plastic sheeting that obscured the clearing from the sky. On the highway outside the zone's gates, a quiet, somber crowd of older residents began to gather along the gravel shoulders, men and women who had lived through the winter of 1975, people who had spent half their lives wondering if the truth would ever surface, standing in the heavy humidity with their eyes fixed on the distant line of hemlock trees. The atmosphere among the crowd was not one of anger or chaotic protest. It was a profound, heavy solemnity, a collective mourning that had been suspended for 50 years and was now finally being allowed to drop its weight against the earth. As the sun began to drop below the high ridges, painting the sky in the jagged, blood-red hues of an alpine twilight, the forensic team finalized the securement of the remains, placing them into specialized, sealable transport cases that would protect the fragile biological structures on their journey to the state medical examiner's facility in Seattle. The caravan reformed, its headlights cutting through the gathering dark of the logging trail as it moved slowly back toward the main highway, leaving behind a cleared, hollowed-out patch of earth that would never again look the same to anyone who knew its history. The suspect was driven away in the rear of the convoy, his face illuminated briefly by the flashing blue emergency lights of the escort cruisers as the vehicles cleared the gates, passing through the line of silent spectators who watched the transport pass with an intensity that felt like a collective curse launched into the dark. The case was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was an active, airtight homicide prosecution built on a rock-solid foundation of forensic genealogy, a detailed confession, and the physical recovery of the victim's remains from a location that only the killer could have known, rendering any potential defense completely obsolete before the first pretrial motions could even be typed into a legal brief. But back at the precinct, inside the empty archive room where the air still carried the faint scent of old paper and structural panic, the supervisor sat looking at the empty metal table, realizing that while the legal victory was absolute, the emotional ledger of the county was still far from balanced. The ghost of 1975 had been dragged from the ravine. The name of the monster had been written into the booking logs, but the historical scar left on the community was a living thing, a trauma that would continue to radiate through the families, the neighborhoods, and the streets of the Pacific Northwest long after the cell door had slammed shut on the land surveyor from the lake for the final time. The arrival of the forensic transport cases at the state medical examiner's facility in Seattle took place under the dead weight of a 2 a.m. freeze, a quiet arrival that skipped the flashing bulbs of the press and moved straight into the unblinking, subterranean glare of the laboratory. The facility was an island of absolute forensic isolation, a fortress of steel tables, high-efficiency particulate air filters, and white light where the messy, chaotic uncertainties of the outside world were crushed down into the unyielding, mathematical vocabulary of bone density and trauma signatures. Inside the primary examination suite, 3 of the state's leading forensic anthropologists stood waiting in full sterile gear, their instruments arranged in a clean, geometric grid that looked like a cold ritual designed to force the silent earth to surrender its secrets. The supervisor of the cold case unit sat on a reinforced stool in the observation gallery behind the thick plate glass, his eyes bloodshot from a 72-hour stretch of operational tracking, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of bitter espresso as he watched the technicians lift the sealable containers onto the metal table with a reverence reserved for the dead. The task ahead was a microscopic, frame-by-frame resurrection of a 50-year-old tragedy, an analytical process that required the team to look past 5 decades of mineral staining and organic erosion to reconstruct the final, terrifying minutes of the victim's life. They worked with computerized axial tomography, laser surface scanners, and fine, soft-bristled brushes that moved across the skeletal fragments with the extreme care of an art restorer cleaning a ruined canvas, translating the abstract horror of the 1975 cold case into an ironclad document of capital murder. Every notch, every discoloration, and every microscopic fissure left by the acidity of the mountain soil was logged into a digital database, building a scientific fortress that would leave no room for a defense attorney to manufacture a sliver of reasonable doubt, or to claim that the old land surveyor's confession had been the product of a mind fractured by age. The room was a vacuum of sound, save for the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the industrial ventilation system and the occasional, flat dictation of metrics into a ceiling-mounted microphone by the lead examiner. As the pale, rain-washed morning light began to touch the high-frosted windows of the facility, the lead anthropologist stepped away from the steel table, lowered her protective mask, and looked up at the supervisor behind the glass with an expression that carried the heavy weight of absolute certainty. The preliminary findings were a devastating, undeniable confirmation of every logistical coordinate laid out in the suspect's midnight confession. The skeletal trauma was precise, mechanical, and perfectly aligned with the mechanics of an overwhelming, predatory force that had left no avenue for survival. The anaerobic clay of the deep ravine had protected the bone structures from the typical decay cycles that obliterate such details in less insulated environments, turning the remains into a permanent, undegradable testimony of violence that could not be cross-examined or explained away. The supervisor stood up, his joints aching against the chill of the observation room, looking down at the neat rows of fragments under the bright lights, realizing that the narrative was finalized, the trap was sprung, and the ghost that had haunted his department for half a century was finally, completely real. Back in the Timber County where the abduction had broken the community's trust in 1975, the legal machinery was turning with a Don Dap, crushing velocity that transformed the local courthouse into a high-stakes arena of structural accountability. The formal indictment was being drafted in a third-floor office that smelled of ink and high-intensity adrenaline, a document that charged the grandfather from the lake with first-degree murder, capital kidnapping, and assault under special circumstances, charges that carried the potential for the ultimate sentence under state law. The prosecuting attorney, a veteran of the state's major crimes division who had built her career on the absolute destruction of organized criminal networks, had taken personal command of the file, recognizing that this was not just another historical case, but a moral trial that would define the region's relationship with its own history. She sat with the cold case detectives until the early hours, reviewing the genomic lineage maps, the surveillance logs from the hardware store, and the newly printed forensic reports from Seattle, weaving them into a single, unbreakable net designed to drop the hammer of justice on the defendant before a jury of his peers. The suspect, meanwhile, had been moved from the general intake block to a high-security, isolated cell within the medical wing of the county jail, placed under a continuous, 24-hour suicide watch to ensure that he didn't use a bedsheet or a plastic implement to cheat the system out of a formal reckoning. He sat on the edge of his cot, his high-visibility orange jumpsuit matching the bright, clinical plastic of the retaining chair, his gaze fixed on the small, reinforced window that looked out onto the concrete walls of the exercise yard. The transition from a respected rural craftsman, a man who repaired wooden boats and watched his great-grandchildren play by the water, to a notorious capital murder suspect was a psychological decompression that seemed to have shrunk his physical frame in a matter of days. He had stopped demanding access to his private ledger, he had stopped responding to the automated announcements of the guards, and he had retreated into a deep, vegetative silence that looked like a man who had finally realized that the walls of his life had collapsed inward, leaving his secrets entirely exposed to the unyielding light of day. The public reaction in the valley had evolved from the early, chaotic shock into a deep, pervasive bitterness, a collective realization that the security they had spent decades rebuilding had been a lie constructed by a master of social performance who had used their trust as a shield. The suspect's cedar cabin by the lake had become a morbid landmark, a dark tourist destination where local residents drove slowly past the yellow crime scene tape, staring at the empty porch and the half-repaired boat hull in the driveway with a mixture of fascination and intense disgust. Neighbors who had shared morning coffee with him, who had trusted him with the keys to their own properties while they traveled, and who had invited him to community dinners found themselves under a cloud of retroactive paranoia, questioning every past interaction, every smile, and every casual conversation they had exchanged with the monster across 30 years. The realization that a man could carry such a horrific secret, that he could live in the midst of a community with such a total absence of visible guilt, was a psychological poison that infected the social fabric of the logging towns, destroying the simple safety that had taken generations to stabilize after the initial horror of 1975. The media coverage had reached a fever pitch that turned the small press briefing room of the sheriff's office into a chaotic jungle of technical cables, high-powered studio lights, and national news anchors, all competing for a fragment of new data, a quote from a distant relative, or an exclusive image of the recovery site in the reforestation zone. The title, 1975 Cold Case Solved, Forensic Genealogy Unearths Dark Legacy, had become a permanent feature on the digital news cycles, a narrative that captured the national imagination because it touched upon the deepest, most universal fears of modern society: the monster hiding in plain sight, the inadequacy of early analog police methods, and the terrifying, relentless precision of modern genetic technology. The supervisor of the cold case unit found himself dodging the cameras in the precinct parking lot, his collar pulled up against the autumn damp, refusing to offer the sound bites or the dramatic performances that the networks were begging for, keeping his focus entirely on the cold, sterile reality of the legal file. He knew that the real battle was not on the television screens, but in the quiet, rules-bound arena of the pretrial hearings, where the public defender would attempt to use every technical loophole to suppress the DNA match or invalidate the legality of the toothpick recovery. The first of those pretrial hearings was scheduled for a Thursday morning, an event that drew a massive, silent crowd that packed the gallery of the main courtroom until the air became warm and thick with the scent of wet wool, rain umbrellas, and collective anticipation. The victim's remaining sister, now a silver-haired woman who carried her family's legacy in her rigid posture, sat in the front row of the gallery, her face looking like carved stone under the high geometric lights of the chamber, her eyes fixed on the door through which the defendant would be led by the armed deputies. When the door finally clicked open and the suspect was brought in, the sound of his leg irons dragging across the polished wood floor was a sharp, metallic strike that cut through the room like a physical shock, forcing every person present to hold their breath as the two eras of the town's history came face to face in the light of day. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the prosecutors. He sat at the defense table next to his public defender, his eyes fixed on the green blotter before him, a man who looked like an empty vessel being moved through a ritual he could no longer control or resist. The hearing was a dry, clinical exercise in constitutional law, a debate over search warrants, the expectation of privacy in discarded waste, and the admissibility of genealogical data that felt entirely removed from the raw, human blood that had been spilled in the woods half a century ago. The public defender, a sharp, tireless advocate who understood that his client was facing a terminal sentence, launched a furious, multi-pronged attack on the methods used by the cold case unit, claiming that the collection of the toothpick from the public bin had constituted an illegal search without a warrant, and that the commercial DNA databases used by the analysts were a violation of genetic privacy rights. The supervisor sat at the prosecution table, his face a mask of professional calm, watching the judge, a man who had spent 40 years on the bench and whose eyes showed a deep, historical weariness that suggested he had seen every trick, every maneuver, and every desperation that a guilty man could throw against the wall of justice. The prosecutor responded not with rhetorical flourishes or emotional appeals, but with a cold, devastating citation of established legal precedent, showing that under state law, discarded property left in a public space like a trash bin carries no expectation of privacy, and that the genealogical research had been conducted entirely within the public use terms of the services involved. She laid out the timeline of the investigation with a surgical clarity that showed the methods had been systematic, ethical, and fully compliant with the highest standards of modern law enforcement, turning the defense's arguments into a series of irrelevant complaints that dissolved under the pressure of the law. The judge listened without interruption, his hand supporting his chin, his gaze shifting occasionally from the legal briefs to the silent, gray-haired defendant who sat like a stone statue at the center of the storm, his destiny being carved out by the cold precision of words he had never considered when he stepped out onto that logging trail in November 1975. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was a dry, authoritative crack that signaled the total collapse of the defense's first line of resistance, a ruling that denied every motion to suppress and declared that the DNA match, the confession, and the forensic evidence from the recovery site were entirely admissible for the upcoming trial. The announcement was a quiet hammer strike that broke the structural hope of the defense team, a moment that left the suspect standing on the absolute edge of a legal execution with no remaining shields, no loopholes, and no escape routes left to explore. As the deputies stood up to lead him back to the transport van, the leg irons clinking in the quiet room, the suspect stopped for a fraction of a second, his head turning slightly toward the gallery, his eyes locking for the briefest, most terrifying instant with those of the victim's sister, an exchange of glances that carried the entire, unredacted weight of 50 years of silence, grief, and unresolved malice before the door slammed shut behind him, leaving the courtroom to erupt into a sudden, chaotic roar of public relief and media frenzy. The total collapse of the defense's preliminary motions acted like a structural demolition inside the public defender's office, leaving the legal team standing in the ruins of a strategy that had completely underestimated the clinical, scientific weight of the state's case. Behind the heavy oak doors of the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted instantly from an investigative hunt into a cold, transactional preparation for an execution, as both sides recognized that a full trial would be nothing more than a formal, public recording of an inevitable verdict. The state attorney refused to offer a plea bargain that would remove the maximum penalty from the table. She felt the historical weight of the county's collective trauma on her shoulders and knew that anything less than the ultimate sentence would be viewed by the community as a betrayal of the girl who had vanished into the November fog of 1975. She ordered her team to begin the process of jury selection, a task that promised to be a logistical nightmare in a valley where virtually every resident over the age of 60 carried a personal, deeply ingrained memory of the night the logging road became a monument to fear. The process of finding 12 objective citizens in a county saturated by 50 years of media coverage and local folklore was a slow, agonizing exercise in psychological screening that turned the main courtroom into a gallery of human history. Hundreds of potential jurors were called, their lives, opinions, and memories parsed by the attorneys with the surgical precision of archaeologists clearing dirt from a fragile bone, looking for any hidden bias, any ancient connection to the victim's family, or any residual sympathy for the gray-haired grandfather who sat motionless at the defense table. Many were dismissed immediately because their voices cracked when they recalled the volunteer searches of the mid-70s, or because they admitted that the arrest of the quiet land surveyor had forced them to reevaluate the safety of their own communities, proving that the psychological poison injected by the killer was still an active, volatile element in the social fabric of the region. The supervisor of the cold case unit sat in the second row of the gallery every single morning, his notebook resting on his knees, watching the faces of his fellow citizens as they were forced to confront the reality that the monster had lived among them as a neighbor, a worker, and a friend, his mask of conformity so flawless that it had resisted the scrutiny of a generation. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the county clerk's office, a separate, Secondary investigation was unfolding as detectives from neighboring jurisdictions began arriving with their own dusty cardboard boxes of unsolved files, seeking to cross-reference the suspect's historical movements with every cold disappearance that had occurred along the Pacific Northwest coast between 1970 and 2000. They were looking at his old employment records, his logging permits, his surveying team logs, and his historical land deeds, mapping his trajectory through the state during his peak years of activity, terrified by the possibility that the 1975 abduction had not been an isolated flash of madness, but the beginning of a silent, undocumented career of predation. The cognitive dissonance of this research was a sickening weight for the young analysts who were forced to contrast his ordinary, everyday civilian timeline, the dates he had purchased his lake cabin, the weekends he had registered his fishing boats, the holidays he had spent with his children, with the grim coordinates of bodies pulled from mountain ravines or skeletal remains discovered by timber crews in the remote backlands. They were discovering that the killer had been a master of structural compartmentalization, an individual who could step out of a midnight nightmare in the woods and slide back into the warm, ordinary rhythm of a family breakfast table without leaving a single visible trace of his violence on his clothes or in his eyes. The suspect's family, those innocent bystanders who had been living in the orbit of his deception for decades, had completely vanished from the public eye, their lives shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces the moment the tactical teams had breached the front door of their cedar cabin on that Friday morning. His children, who were now older adults with families of their own, were forced to navigate a horrifying, retroactive reality where every childhood memory, every camping trip, and every holiday photograph was suddenly infected by the knowledge that their father was a monster who had carried the secret of a violent execution beneath his grandfatherly smile. They issued a brief, formal statement through an attorney, expressing their profound, unmitigated grief for the victim's remaining sister and declaring that they had possessed absolutely no knowledge of the dark history that their father had buried beneath the concrete of his routine before retreating into a silent, self-imposed isolation to escape the relentless glare of the media cameras that lingered at the edge of their properties. The community, despite its rage against the killer, treated the family's collapse with a quiet, somber respect, recognizing that they too were victims of his calculated malice, collateral damage in a 50-year war against the truth that had left no one in his circle untouched by the radioactive fallout of his exposure. As the date for the opening statements of the trial drew closer, the media circus outside the courthouse expanded until the perimeter resembled a high-tech encampment, a forest of satellite dishes, heavy production vans, and white-hot lights that turned the gray stone steps of the building into a permanent television set for the national news networks. The title, 1975 Cold Case Solved, Forensic Genealogy Unearths Dark Legacy, had become a cultural anchor, a narrative that resonated across the country because it touched upon the deepest anxieties of the modern era, the vulnerability of the analog past, the terrifying longevity of hidden evil, and the ultimate, inevitable triumph of genetic technology over the passage of time. The local businesses along the courthouse square reported a surreal boom in traffic as journalists, legal analysts, and curious spectators from across the state flooded the diners and coffee shops, turning the solemn final act of a human tragedy into a highly commercialized public spectacle that threatened to overwhelm the quiet dignity of the legal proceedings. But inside the courtroom itself, the state attorney maintained an ironclad control over the environment, enforcing a strict protocol of silence and professional decorum that left no room for the theatrical displays or sensationalized outbursts that the networks were desperately craving for their evening broadcasts. The weekend before the trial was set to begin, a sudden, unseasonal mountain storm rolled in off the coast, burying the Timber Valley under a gray, relentless deluge of freezing rain that turned the rivers into raging torrents of white foam and flooded the drainage canals that lined the highway loop. The supervisor of the cold case unit used the isolation of the storm to conduct a final, exhaustive review of the evidence locker, sitting alone in the dim light of the property room with the original 1975 folders laid out before him like the relics of a dead civilization. He looked at the old typed statements of witnesses who had since passed away, the grainy diagrams of the logging road shoulder drawn by hands that had long since retired from service, and the small, sealed glass slide containing the microscopic sample that had survived the 1984 flood. He realized that this trial was not just about punishing an old man in an orange jumpsuit. It was an act of historical restitution, a formal process of rewriting the town's biography to ensure that the girl who had stepped out into the mountain twilight of November 1975 was no longer remembered as an unsolved equation, but as a life whose value was verified by the relentless, multi-generational refusal of the law to let her memory die in the dark. The rain was still striking the high-arched windows of the courthouse on Monday morning when the deputies finally cleared the main corridor and allowed the public to fill the gallery for the official commencement of State v. Arthur Lee. The room was packed to its absolute capacity, the air heavy with the scent of wet wool, damp umbrellas, and the electric tension of a community that had waited 50 years to hear the formal reading of the charges against the Phantom of the Logging Roads. The victim's remaining sister sat in the front row, a small, elegant figure wrapped in a dark shawl, her face looking like carved marble under the high geometric lights of the chamber, her eyes fixed on the door through which the defendant would be led by the deputies. When the door finally clicked open and the suspect was brought in, the sound of his leg irons dragging across the polished wood floor was a sharp, metallic strike that cut through the room like a physical shock, forcing every person present to hold their breath as the two eras of the Valley's history came face to face in the light of day. He didn't look at the gallery, he didn't look at the prosecutors. He sat at the defense table next to his public defender, his eyes fixed on the green blotter before him, a man who looked like an empty vessel being moved through a ritual he could no longer control or resist. The state attorney stepped to the podium for her opening statement, her movements fluid and entirely devoid of hesitation, her voice a low, commanding tone that instantly silenced the residual murmurs of the gallery and brought the entire room into the focus of her narrative. She didn't use hyperbole. She didn't need to, because the facts she laid out were a series of devastating, calculated hammer strikes that left the defense table completely exposed to the reality of the crime. She moved the jury through the timeline of November 1975, reconstructing the freezing dark of the night, the flash of the highway diner neon, and the sudden, random intersection of a vibrant 20-year-old woman with a predator who had spent his life waiting for the perfect, unmonitored second of vulnerability. She described the abduction with a chilling, matter-of-fact precision that made the skin crawl, detailing the staged breakdown, the silencing of the screams, and the absolute, clinical choice to drive her vehicle away into the deep logging trails before the town could even register her disappearance from the highway. The presentation was a structural demolition of the defendant's civilian identity. She showed the jury the genetic lineage maps that had led the digital dragnet to his doorstep. She detailed the recovery of his DNA from the discarded toothpick in the public bin, and she projected the high-definition photographs of the recovery site onto the large screens that lined the courtroom walls. The images of the white fragments embedded in the gray clay of the state reforestation zone were a profound, physical shock to the jury, several of whom covered their mouths as the clinical language of forensic anthropology stripped away the abstract myth of the cold case and replaced it with the brutal, skeletal reality of a violent execution. The prosecutor pointed her finger directly at the silent, gray-haired man at the defense table, her voice rising to a sharp, authoritative pitch that echoed off the high plaster ceilings of the chamber. For 50 years, this man walked your trails, he surveyed your land, he built your community, and he believed that the deep mud of the ravine had swallowed his guilt forever. But the truth is a patient thing, gentlemen of the jury. It doesn't degrade, it doesn't forget, and today it has come to demand a full and final accounting for the life he violently extinguished in the woods. When she sat down, the silence inside the courtroom was so absolute that the sound of the rain striking the glass outside felt like a rhythmic, heavy applause from the past, a validation of the decades of work that had led to this moment of total exposure. The public defender stood up for his opening statement, his posture straight but his expression bearing the intense, heavy strain of a man who knew he was fighting a war that had already been lost on the microscopic level of the DNA sequencing. He didn't try to deny the science. He didn't try to claim that his client was innocent of the physical act of violence that had occurred in the winter of 1975. Instead, he chose a highly controversial, desperate strategy that sought to separate the elderly grandfather sitting before the jury from the younger, volatile surveyor who had stepped out of the timber shadows 50 years ago, presenting his client as a broken, penitent soul whose life since the crime had been a continuous, silent penance of ordinary, peaceful conformity. He spoke of his client's steady employment, his devotion to his family, and the total absence of any secondary violence in his record over 5 decades, arguing that the passage of time had essentially executed the monster of 1975 long before the police had arrived with their warrants. The argument was a psychological gamble that hit the gallery with the force of an insult, triggering a low, bitter murmur of disgust from the older residents who remembered the decades of fear, the locked doors, and the unceasing grief of the family that had been forced to rot in the dark while the killer enjoyed the fruits of a peaceful retirement. The supervisor of the cold case unit looked at the jury, watching their eyes narrow as the defense attorney attempted to spin a narrative of redemption out of a career of total, unremitting cowardice, realizing that the strategy was a symptom of complete legal bankruptcy. The monster hadn't changed. He had simply grown old, his instincts for survival forcing him to adopt the camouflage of a harmless grandfather to protect the horrific secret that lay buried beneath the peat of the mountain ravine. The opening day of the trial ended with the lines drawn clearly in the sand, a battle between the unyielding, mathematical certainty of modern forensic science and the desperate, philosophical maneuvers of a defense team that had nothing left to throw against the wall of justice but the gray hair and wrinkled frame of a captured predator. As the court adjourned and the deputies stood to lead the defendant back to the transport van, the clinking of his irons was the only answer to the silent fury of the crowd, a sound that signaled the beginning of a multi-week siege that would force the town to look directly into the eyes of its past and decide what price had to be paid for a 50-year-old debt written in blood. The second week of the forensic presentation ground into motion under a sky that had turned from a dark slate gray to a blinding, high-altitude white, casting a cold, cinematic light through the arched windows of the third-floor courtroom. The administrative skirmishes of the jury selection and the initial opening arguments were long past, leaving the well of the court completely cleared for the real engine of the state's case, the dense, unbribable delivery of the scientific data that would reduce the land surveyor's decades of social camouflage to a meaningless series of mathematical coordinates. The prosecution team moved with the fluid, mechanical precision of executioners, systematically converting the courtroom into a high-tech forensic theater where the ghost story of 1975 was stripped of its mystery, piece by piece, before a jury that sat in a state of absolute, paralyzed immersion. The supervisor of the cold case unit remained locked into his second-row gallery seat, his jaw clenched, his eyes tracking the micro-movements of the gray-haired defendant who sat at the defense table like an empty hull that had been fished from the deep water of the mountain canals. The state attorney's first witness for this scientific phase was the chief molecular biologist from the Specialized Private Genomics Archive in California, a sharp, composed analyst who took the stand with a thick leather ledger containing the sequence data extracted from the wax-sealed slide that had survived the 1984 precinct basement flood. She spoke with a cool, steady tone that instantly drained the room of its residual emotional static, explaining the extraction process not as a theory or a novel experiment, but as a rigid application of the immutable laws of chemistry to historical biological material. She utilized the massive digital projection screens to move the jury through the single nucleotide polymorphism analysis, demonstrating how the genetic signatures recovered from the steering wheel of the victim's idling vehicle had been matched with absolute certainty to the distant branches of the family lineage that had settled in the Timber Valley in the late 1960s. She then shifted the digital display to show the comparative short tandem repeat matrix extracted from the discarded wooden toothpick that the surveillance team had recovered from the gas pump public trash bin near the lumber yards. The numbers and alleles flashed on the screens in twin, parallel columns, one column holding the metrics from the 1975 archive sample, the other holding the fresh data from the 2024 recovery shift. They were identical, marker for marker, a perfect chemical mirror image that left zero architectural room for environmental contamination, technical degradation, or human manipulation over 50 long years of storage. The probability of this genetic alignment occurring by sheer coincidence in a random population, the biologist stated, her gaze locking directly onto the eyes of the jury foreman, is calculated at approximately 1 in 9.6 trillion. To put that in perspective, gentlemen of the jury, you would have to search thousands of Earths to find another human being who could have deposited that specific biological signature onto the controls of that vehicle on that freezing November twilight. The public defender rose for his cross-examination with a frantic, defensive aggression that betrayed the deep strategic panic under which his office was operating, launching a highly technical assault on the potential for cellular migration within the evidence crates and the sterilization protocols of the private facility. He questioned the temperature fluctuations of the property locker during the 1984 flood event, the chemical stability of the wax sealant across half a century of variable pressure, and the possibility that an external handler from the 70s had left a latent trace that corrupted the sequencing data. But the biologist was a veteran of the state's capital murder circuit. She deflected every probe with a surgical precision, citing the pristine internal controls, the independent verification audits conducted by federal laboratories, and the unyielding structural stability of dry cellular DNA when insulated from ultraviolet degradation. She left the attorney standing in the center of the well with nothing but a series of thin, hypothetical scenarios that dissolved under the weight of her expertise, forcing him to sit down with a tight, frustrated nod that signaled the complete destruction of his scientific defense. The presentation then plunged the courtroom into an even more immediate, visceral confrontation with the physical reality of the crime scene as the lead forensic anthropologist from the State Medical Examiner's facility in Seattle was called to the stand. He carried a series of high-resolution, three-dimensional digital renderings of the skeletal remains that had been recovered from Grid Square 4 in the state reforestation zone, images that turned the pale plaster walls of the chamber into a grim exhibition of skeletal trauma and calculated burial mechanics. The anthropologist spoke with a flat, objective detachment that made the details sound even more terrifying, describing the specific fractures, the soil displacement markings left on the bone structures, and the spatial positioning of the remains within the anaerobic gray clay of the mountain ravine. He pointed his electronic pointer to a specific rendering of the victim's third and fourth cervical vertebrae, which were displayed on the screens with a stark, red-highlighted fracture line running through their delicate interior arches, a structural failure that he explained with a mechanical clarity that made the skin of the spectators crawl. This specific trauma, the anthropologist said, his pointer tracing the break with a slow, deliberate movement, is a textbook indicator of an intense, hyperextension injury caused by the application of concentrated, kinetic force to the upper spinal column of an individual who is actively resisting manual restraint. The clean, unremodeled nature of these fracture borders confirms that this structural collapse occurred at or immediately prior to the moment of death, providing an absolute biological signature of a violent execution that left no room for survival. The victim's remaining sister covered her face with her shawl in the front row, her body shaking with a quiet, devastating grief that seemed to vibrate through the old hardwood benches, forcing several members of the jury to avert their eyes from the screens and stare down at their hands with tight, grim expressions. The anthropologist didn't stop there. He moved on to the analysis of the tool marks discovered on the secondary skeletal elements, demonstrating that the suspect had utilized a specialized surveyor's spade, consistent with the tools registered to his logging crew in 1975, to force the body deep into the gray peat beneath the cedar root structures before the ground could freeze for the winter. He demonstrated how the angle of the clay displacement and the crushing injuries to the pelvic cradle proved that the burial had been a rapid, high-intensity effort to conceal the evidence before the dawn could break over the high timber ridges of the valley. The presentation was a total, unredacted exposure of the raw malice that had occurred in those woods 50 years ago, a narrative written in bone that completely destroyed the defense's attempt to portray the defendant as a harmless, passive country craftsman who had outlived the shadow of his youth. The public defender's cross-examination of the anthropologist was a short, somber affair. He didn't try to challenge the findings or dispute the cause of death, knowing that any attempt to argue with the skeletal data would only serve to further alienate the jury and highlight the absolute brutality of the act. Instead, He focused on the impossibility of determining the exact psychological state of the killer from the bone structures alone, trying to suggest that the violence could have been the result of a sudden, chaotic panic rather than a calculated, premeditated execution. It was a weak, philosophical maneuver that felt entirely empty when contrasted with the cold, hard reality of the fractured throat bone on the screen, a reminder that in a capital murder trial, abstract arguments have a habit of dying a quick death when confronted with the physical wreckage of a human life. During the afternoon recess, the atmosphere in the courthouse corridors was thick with a heavy, expectant energy. The reporters and legal analysts huddled in small groups near the windows, their voices low as they reviewed the devastating momentum of the state's forensic presentation. The title, 1975 Cold Case Solved, Forensic Genealogy Unearths Dark Legacy, was no longer just a headline. It had become an absolute, unassailable legal reality that was systematically crushing the defense table into submission. The supervisor of the cold case unit stood by the water fountain, watching the local residents who packed the hallway, noticing how the anger of the early days had shifted into a deep, collective desire for finality, a hunger for the gavel to fall so that the town could finally bury its most monstrous secret once and for all. He knew that the prosecution had one final card to play before closing their case: the presentation of the recorded confession itself, the voice of the grandfather from the suburbs describing his own violence in his own words, a moment that would seal the cage on his destiny forever. When court reconvened, the state attorney stood up and requested permission from the judge to play the audio logging tapes from the midnight interrogation that had taken place in the basement of the precinct following the suspect's arrest. The defense made a final, desperate objection, claiming that the audio quality was distorted and that the emotional impact of the recording would be unfairly prejudicial to the jury, but the judge denied the motion with a sharp, authoritative click of his pen, ordering the bailiff to dim the lights. The room went dark, the only illumination coming from the blue glow of the digital screens, and then, out of the high-fidelity speakers mounted in the corners of the ceiling, came the sound of a heavy door slamming shut, followed by the dry, paper-like rasp of the suspect's voice cutting through the silence of 50 years. The recording was a psychological horror show that turned the air in the courtroom to pure ice. The suspect's voice didn't carry the trembling uncertainty of an old man or the hysterical remorse of a broken penitent. It was flat, clinical, and completely detached, the voice of a construction foreman detailing the logistics of a roofing job or a concrete pour, recounting the mechanics of an abduction and an execution with a terrifyingly casual familiarity. He described the convenience store parking lot, the swarming mosquitoes under the neon light, and the precise moment his hand had closed over the victim's mouth to silence her cries, his words dropping into the quiet room like a series of slow, deliberate hammer blows against the sanity of the audience. "She didn't see me coming," the recorded voice whispered, the static of the tape a constant, rhythmic hiss behind his words. "She was just standing there by the door, her keys in her hand, a perfect target of opportunity. Once I had her in the truck, I knew there was no turning back. You can't let a witness go once they've seen your face in the dark." The jury sat completely frozen, their eyes locked onto the empty chair at the defense table where the living suspect sat with his head hung low, his gray hair catching the blue light of the monitors, a man forced to listen to his younger, monstrous self lay out the blueprints of his own destruction. The recording moved into the deep woods of the wildlife preserve, the suspect describing the sound of the pickup truck's tires crushing the palmetto fronds, the absolute silence of the swamp that had drowned out her final pleas for mercy, and the mechanical precision with which he had forced her to her knees in the mud. She asked about her mother. The voice from the speakers said, a chilling lack of emotion radiating from the audio stream. "She told me her mother was waiting for her, that she had to be home by midnight, but the dark had already won, you see. Once you cross that line, you just have to finish the job and find a way to live with the noise in your head when the sun comes up." The confession was the final, definitive nail in the coffin of the defense's redemption narrative. It proved that the compliance and conformity he had practiced for 50 years had not been the product of a reformed soul, but the calculated camouflage of a coward who had used the peace of a suburban retirement to hide from the blood on his hands. When the tape finally clicked off and the high geometric lights of the courtroom flickered back to life, The silence inside the chamber was so intense it felt as though the entire room had been submerged in the brackish water of the swamp, leaving the spectators and the jury completely drained of breath. The state attorney stepped to the podium one last time, her posture straight, her voice a low, commanding resonance that put the final period on the multi-day siege. "The state rests," she said, her eyes locking with those of the foreman of the jury, signaling the end of the waiting, the completion of the record, and the total, unrestricted victory of the truth over the darkness of the past.